Member Mike, test 1. Member Mike, test 2. Check, 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 test, test, test.
Got it.
What do you? Witness mic test, or in this event, clerk mic test, test, testing, 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 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Test, 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 1, 2, 3. Witness mic, 1, 2, 3, test 1, test 2, test 3. Is it okay?
That's great.
All right.
Good afternoon, all. The committee will come to order. As a reminder, when we met last, we began consideration of a base text consisting of a biennial budget resolution. We considered 15 amendments. 3 of those were adopted, including Senator Whitehouse's bipartisan budget resolution and the Senate amendment, Senator Blunt's annual reconciliation amendment, and Senator Bennett's reform of the Senate Budget Committee's membership amendment. 8 amendments were not agreed to. 4 amendments were withdrawn. As previously agreed to, amendments will be considered in the order of the list distributed to staff, and on the dais in front of you, members who filed amendments were also asked to include accompanying report language. Therefore, all votes on amendments to the legislative language are also votes on the accompanying report language. It is now in order to consider, as we reconvene this markup, amendment number 16, offered by the gentlelady from Hawaii, Senator Hirono. The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 16, offered by Ms. Hirono.
Mr. Chairman.
The gentlelady, the distinguished senator from the state of Hawaii, is recognized.
Thank you. My amendment is straightforward and provides a process for ensuring that the United States does not default on its obligations while maintaining a role for Congress. The amendment makes addressing the debt limit primarily an administrative function of the Treasury Secretary pursuant to congressional approval. The amendment directs the Secretary to notify Congress that the federal debt limit will hit the current statutory limit within 180 days. If Congress does not act, the limit would be suspended for a period of 1 year and the process would repeat. My amendment also provides for a fast-track process for Congress to consider a joint resolution of disapproval, which, if passed by both chambers and signed by the President, would halt suspension of the limit. And this is a sensible way to de-weaponize the debt limit by substituting math for politics. I certainly urge my colleagues to support the amendment. I just want to note that, obviously these are debts that have already been incurred, and there will be massive consequences, negative consequences, if we do not raise the debt limit as needed. So my amendment would, as I say, de-weaponize this entire process and making it much more a ministerial function with our involvement. Thank you.
Any member wish to claim time in opposition? Gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Undeniably, weaponizing the debt ceiling is an unproductive exercise, and that's the way we have talked about the debt ceiling so often. But the truth is, in my short time here, it has been a productive tool for folks who didn't have any other avenue to have this conversation. Now, whether we go back to Bill Clinton's era and the passage of the line item veto, whether we're talking about the big budget deal with John Boehner and President Obama in 2011, time and time again we have seen that the only pieces of legislation that make a positive impact on the trajectory of debt to GDP come when we force a conversation with one another. We've tried so many different ways to provide Congress with the incentive to get together and talk about the serious issues that ail us. And the most effective, doesn't mean it's the best system, but the most effective that I have seen in my time here has been the debt ceiling, and I am reluctant to see what is given to the Congress as a constitutional function turned over to the administration as a ministerial duty. Can we find a more productive pathway to use the debt ceiling? We can. I think some of the conversations we've had with Senator Whitehouse on debt to GDP provide that avenue, but I would oppose delegating this to an administration when we are still so desperately in search of a mechanism to bring us together to deal with a spending trajectory that we both agree, a debt trajectory that we both agree is moving in the wrong direction. I yield back.
Any other member wish to discuss the amendment? Gentlelady from Hawaii.
Thank you. I'd like to comment because the argument is that somehow this debate that we have over the debt limit raising is the only way that we can really effect certain changes that impact the debt to GDP, but we had no problems doing that by passing a $1.5 trillion tax cut. And that added a lot to the deficit and the debt, and it had absolutely nothing to do with a debate over the need to raise the debt limit.
If the gentlelady would yield, I stipulate that we have lots of ways of making things worse. We're very good at making things worse. My only point was that the debate around the debt ceiling in time and time again in my short time here has made things just a little bit better. It's a dangerous game to play, as the gentlelady suggests, but it is the only tool that I've seen be effective at all. And that was my only point. I thank the gentlelady for yielding.
Mr. Chairman?
Gentleman from Colorado.
Thank you. I have a similar amendment that I'm not going to introduce, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate very much the way you're conducting this hearing, but I'd like to make a comment about this
Absolutely.
one, if that's okay. I want to thank both Senator Hirono and Senator Schatz for their amendments with respect to the debt ceiling. In 2011, the S&P downgraded our debt due to the brinksmanship and the paralysis in Congress. In fact, in downgrading our debt, they found that, quote, the effectiveness, stability, and predictability of American policymaking and political institutions have weakened at a time of ongoing fiscal and economic challenges to a degree more than we envisioned when we assigned a negative outlook on the rating on April 18, 2011. This was as much about our behavior, Mr. Chairman, as it was about the country's finances. According to the Treasury Department, the U.S. Treasury Department, Congress's near failure to raise the debt ceiling in 2011 was one contributor that led to a $2.4 trillion reduction in household wealth for the second and third quarters of that year. This isn't a theoretical debating point in Congress. That's what happened to household wealth because of our inability to work together on this issue. Consumer confidence fell 22% in late 2011 and into 2012 because of these actions. And I think these amendments reflect an effort to prevent another self-inflicted crisis. Represents one of the most meaningful reforms we can make when it comes to our nation's fiscal policy. And while I think there's been a lot of good work done by this committee, I think it is a shame that we're not able to deal with what is this self-inflicted wound that damages the American people every time we go through it and has done nothing, in my humble opinion, to change the trajectory of the debt or the deficit. The proof is in the pudding. It's the first time in American history when unemployment is falling and our deficit is increasing. That has never happened before in American history. I would suggest that that in and of itself tells us what a poor tool the debt ceiling is for dealing with our debt and our deficit. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield.
Other comments from members? Gentleman from Texas.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much, and I appreciate the arguments around the table. As a matter of fact, I agree with the gentleman from Colorado that the American people do need to see that this committee, subcommittees and committees that we make up, that we represent, are serious about actually taking on tough issues. But I would say to the gentleman that broad statements, when we know that spending that we control and actually make were held in check for 12 years, literally 12 years, as we look back from '08 forward. Now, we could say 8 or 9 of those, but literally we have held ourselves in place. It is outside factors that we also do control, but it is not spending. It's not spending that goes through our regular order. It's not spending that we necessarily control, but it's spending that we have the responsibility for. So I would hope that as we would talk about these responsibilities that we also have responsibilities to what might be called mandatory spending. Because from 2008, 2009, 2010, 2011, 2012, 2013, 2014, 2015, and 2016, things were flat.
If I may, Mr. Chairman.
And so that was a serious attempt. To say that we have done nothing would not, I don't think, really be a fair assessment. there were things done. There was a conscious effort that required hundreds of votes, and in split government, we made that happen. So would be my hope that what we could do is aim where the real firepower is, or what we need to accomplish, not just say, well, it's just bigger than we are. Thank you.
Senator Bennett.
I would just say, Mr. Chairman, that I appreciate very much the sentiments of my colleague from Texas. I do think we've done nothing with respect to the deficit. I think that it is certainly true that we have reduced domestic discretionary spending by 30% since Ronald Reagan was president. From the vantage point of the next generation of Americans, what we're doing to them is failing to invest in them the way our parents and grandparents were willing to invest in us, and loading them up with a horrific debt at the same time. And I don't see that as a victory. I think that we have cut in the place that's been easiest for us to cut. It's been painful for the next generation of Americans, and we've done nothing to solve the fiscal crisis that the country faces.
Other comments?
You go first.
The distinguished co-chair is recognized.
Thank you. I rise in support of Senator Hirono's amendment. And I understand that for some of our members, one purpose of the debt ceiling vote is to more fully address our fiscal health. But we cannot have an honest and productive conversation about our fiscal health when our economy is being leveraged for political gain. This amendment would be a vast improvement over our current process by allowing the Treasury Secretary to suspend the debt ceiling unless Congress were to pass a joint resolution of disapproval. It is a positive step forward to addressing a problem that urgently needs to be fixed, and I urge support.
Any other comments? Senator Whitehouse.
Just briefly, I've compared before the debt limit to a bear trap in the bedroom, and everybody knows that we need to walk around it. Everybody knows that setting it off would create enormous pain and be flamingly stupid, but we are capable of doing pretty dumb things from time to time, and particularly when we're at loggerheads. So I think our country is better off, even though I recognize the opportunity that the debt limit conversation creates. I think we're better off de-weaponizing this particular vulnerability because should the day come that we actually step in that bear trap, look out.
Any other comments?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from Texas.
I would urge us to run to the bear trap.
The question is on agreeing to the amendment offered by the gentlelady from Hawaii, Ms. Hirono. Senator Hirono. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Whitehouse. Aye. Mr. Whitehouse votes aye. Mr. Yarmouth. Mr. Bennett. Aye. Mr. Bennett votes aye. Mr. Roybo Allard. Mr. Schatz. Aye. Mr. Schatz votes aye. Mr. Kilmer. Aye. Mr. Kilmer votes aye. Mr. Hirono. Mr. Hirono votes aye. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Sessions.
No.
Mr. Sessions votes no. Mr. Perdue. No. Mr. Perdue votes no. Mr. Woodall. No. Mr. Woodall votes no. Mr. Langford. Mr. Langford votes no. Mr. Arrington. No. Mr. Arrington votes no. Ms. Ernst. No. Ms. Ernst votes no. Co-Chair Lowy.
Aye.
Co-Chair Lowy votes aye. Co-Chair Womack.
No.
Co-Chair Womack votes no.
Any members wishing to vote or change a vote? Clerk will tally.
Of the members appointed by the Speaker of the House and Senate Majority Leader, on those vote, the ayes are 7 and the noes are 0. Of the members appointed by the House Minority Leader and the Senate Majority Leader, the ayes are 0 and the noes are 6. The amendment threshold is not met.
And with that, the amendment is not agreed to. It is now in order to consider amendment number 17, offered by the gentleman from Colorado, Senator Bennett.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I will withdraw the amendment.
Gentleman has withdrawn amendment number 17. It's now in order to consider amendment number 18, offered by Senator Langford and Representative Arrington. The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 18, offered by Mr. Langford.
Amendment number 18 is on the table, and I'll recognize the gentleman from Oklahoma, Senator Langford.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment is Representative Arrington and Senator Ernst and I all bring it's a fix that's internal. We have a budget allocation, and then we have the actual outlay and spending, and that actual number typically changes by about $16 billion off a budget gimmick we all affectionately know as CHIMPS, Changes in Mandatory Program. So what happens is we take the amount in the Crime Victims Fund, typically, that is dedicated to go to victims of crime, and actually don't send it to victims of crime. We hold it back in reserve instead of sending it out to rape victims, assault victims, their families, deal with criminal justice issues. We don't spend that, though we say we're going to. We hold it and then spend that money somewhere else and pretend we spent it. Year after year, the same gimmick is used. That same $10 billion or so that's in the Crime Victims Fund is allocated every single year, and we pretend we're going to spend it for crime victims and actually don't. Spend it for other things internally and then respend it the next year. Everyone knows this is a Washington gimmick. This is something I've raised in the Appropriations Committee every year. This is an issue that each year we've had an open discussion about it in the Appropriations Committee. Dick Durbin joined me in opposing it last year, saying we have got to resolve this, that this is an issue that is a shame on Congress that this gimmicky thing is done every year. This is a way to be able to slowly wean ourselves off of this. It is not a prohibition next year. It is a step-by-step over the next few years, taking a couple $1 billion off. It doesn't reduce our spending. It just makes our spending real. To what we tell the American people we're actually spending that amount, not that amount, plus another secret $16 billion over here we're not telling them. So there are good chimps and bad chimps, and we all know that term back and forth on it. The changes in mandatory program, I'm really talking about things like the Crime Victims Fund, and that's what this starts to address, is ways to be able to not have to pretend we're changing our spending, but to really do it with a transparent way. So this is a transparency piece, and it's trying to be able to fix a long-term problem that we've had in Congress, and I would support its adoption.
Any other members? Gentleman from Texas, Mr. Arrington.
Mr. Chairman, I obviously support it, but I want to go a little further. It's more than just a shame. It's a scam when we pretend to show savings to offset various programs that aren't really there. And now I hope, and there are a lot of things that I'd like to have gotten done through this process that I know my colleagues would share those sentiments on other initiatives. At a minimum, Mr. Chairman, at a minimum, we've got to be able to deal honestly with the American people. People go to prison over these Enron-like accounting schemes. So I learned something new. I'm a new member every few weeks. When I discovered the bad chimps and how we pretend to save money and we project that and we communicate that in documents to the American people, and in fact, that's just not true. That's in West Texas, that's just lying. And I hope we're all against lying, stealing, and cheating. I hope we can start there. That's what this represents to me. So I support it, obviously, passionately. And I encourage every member across the aisle to stand with us and oppose these schemes.
Any member wish to claim time in opposition? Senator Whitehouse.
I have no objection to the substance of this, but I would very much like to see our work in this select committee pass, and I have grave concerns that this amendment will call down the wrath of the appropriators upon us. And so for that reason, I intend to vote no, but I don't want that vote to be misconstrued as substantive disagreement. I just think it becomes a poison pill in many corners.
Any other comments? Gentlelady from New York.
As an appropriator, provisions known as chimps are a long-standing device used to provide offsets for some appropriation bills. Their use is thoroughly baked into appropriations totals. Therefore, a discussion over chimps cannot be separated from discussions over what the appropriations top line should be. For several years now, chimp limits have been addressed in budget resolutions as part of the overall picture for appropriations funding. So I think we should stick with that approach rather than permanently writing new rules into the Budget Act. And for those reasons, I oppose the amendment.
Senator Langford.
Just a brief comment back to the gentlelady on that. I'm very aware this is baked in, and it's typical. I'm just trying to bake it out. And I'm supportive of raising the limits of what we actually put in appropriations if we give the American people the real number. At this point, we're telling them one number, but we're actually doing a different one. I'm just trying to give us one number that we can do consistently on it.
I would just say to my friend that you're supportive of raising the numbers, but there may be some disagreement on the amount that you want to raise and the amount that I want to raise, and that some may want to decrease and others may want to decrease. So it's really part of the whole process, and that's why I'm against it.
Any other comments from the members? Representative Arrington.
And I do have tremendous respect for our co-chair, and I won't say much more. In fact, this will be the last thing I say, and we can take a vote. The American people, working families, small businesses in my district and your districts alike cannot operate this way. And we hear this notion that Congress plays by a different set of rules. There is nothing that highlights that more in this conversation. I get some of these things about the debt ceiling and debt targets but things that are not, that we claim they are, and things that are, that we claim are not, is disingenuous is nice. Deceptive is more what I think about it when I read about these chimps and other gimmicks. I don't know as much about the appropriations process, so I'm going to be very deferential, but it blows my mind that we would have the audacity to operate in this manner in a way that truly would call not just the integrity of a family in this country, a hard-working business person or a man or woman, but it would call into question criminal behavior. So I'm going to yield back, scratching my head on this one if we can't get it passed, but with all due respect, Madam Chair.
And I would just like to say I appreciate your comments. I think on this one, we have to agree to disagree, because if I were making a list and you were making a list of some of the outrageous things that comes from maybe the Congress, maybe the White House, maybe some of the principals, we'd have a long discussion. So maybe we should just agree to disagree on this one. Thank you.
Are we ready to vote? Question is on agreeing to the amendment offered by the gentleman from Oklahoma, Senator Langford. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Whitehouse votes no. Mr. Yarmouth. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bennett votes no. Ms. Roybal-Allard. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schatz votes no. Mr. Kilmer. Mr. Kilmer votes no. Ms. Hirono. Ms. Hirono votes no. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Blunt votes yes. Mr. Sessions. Mr. Sessions votes aye. Mr. Perdue. Mr. Perdue votes yes. Mr. Woodall. Mr. Woodall votes aye. Mr. Langford. Mr. Langford votes yes. Mr. Arrington. Mr. Arrington votes yes. Ms. Ernst. Mr. Ernst votes yes. Co-Chair Lowy. Co-Chair Lowy votes no. Co-Chair Womack.
Yes.
Co-Chair Womack votes yes. Of the members appointed by the Speaker of the House and the Senate Majority Leader on this vote, the ayes are 8 and the noes are 0. Of the members appointed by the House Minority Leader and the Senate Minority Leader, the ayes are 0 and the noes are 6. The amendment threshold is not met.
The amendment then is not agreed to. Given that Representative Yarmouth is still en route, it is now in order to consider amendment number 20, offered by the gentleman from Washington, Representative Kilmer. The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 20, offered by Mr. Kilmer.
Representative Kilmer is recognized in support of his amendment for 5 minutes.
Thank you, co-chairs. So throughout this process, I've consistently said that Congress can't begin to meaningfully address the debt and deficit challenges that we face until we get a real handle on what our financial situation actually is. I liken it to when about 10 years ago, I weighed about 90 pounds more than I do now. I refused to step on a scale, and only until I started getting on the scale was I actually able to get a handle on my situation and do something about it. Unfortunately, right now, our nation's financial statements, which actually provide pretty important information about our assets and liabilities and revenues and expenses, pretty much go unnoticed by members of Congress because they're buried in about a 300-page report that many members aren't even aware of. So this amendment would bring that information to the forefront so every member is aware of where things stand by requiring the House and the Senate budget committees to hold a joint fiscal state of the nation hearing each Congress where the Comptroller General could come in and give a thorough update on the nation's fiscal health in an accurate and nonpartisan format. To maximize member participation, the amendment would direct the chairs of each budget committee to allow members to wave on to the committee, and it would require a video recording of the hearing to be made publicly available on each committee's website. And additionally, the amendment includes report language encouraging the Republican and Democratic caucuses in the House and the Senate to convene a meeting for the Comptroller General to present this information to both bodies. And then finally, the amendment recommends that the Committee on House Administration and the Secretary of the Senate incorporate content from this fiscal state of the nation for new members so they have a sense of what the stakes are when they come here. Initially, when I brought this up earlier, I was hoping that we could do something bigger and bolder in this regard in working with the chairs and getting input from the committees. I think this at least would take a meaningful step forward in getting on the scale and hopefully doing something about it. And with that, I yield back.
You've heard from the gentleman in support of his amendment. Are there those who wish to speak in support or claim time in opposition? Gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Woodall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As Mr. Kilmer indicated, he had a bolder plan when he began. It was a plan I wasn't comfortable with, and I wanted to thank him for going time and time again, trying to find a way to make this work. It's true, we don't just want to climb on the scale. We want the scale to give us good news at the end of the day, but it'll never give us good news if we can't find a way to start on the scale. I think this committee was created in hopes that if you sat around with one another and worked hard enough and long enough with one another, you'd be able to make some incremental paths forward. And if we are able to find partners on other issues in the way that Mr. Kilmer was willing to partner and work and not take no for an answer, keep working towards yes, I'm optimistic not only about this committee's work, but about work across the board. So I oppose this amendment in its original form. I intend to support the amendment as it's drafted today.
Ms. Lowy.
I support this amendment. It requires the budget committees to hold an annual hearing with GAO. This additional hearing could be a worthwhile supplement to what the budget committees already do and could provide useful insights into our fiscal situation. So I thank the gentleman.
Mr. Arrington.
Mr. Chairman, I support this and this provision, this amendment, and I think it's long overdue. There will be things that I hope we achieve in this committee and beyond where we put greater self-imposed triggers and enforcement mechanisms to override the nature of this beast and sometimes our lack of collective political will. But ultimately, the good old-fashioned American way should be that the American people have empowered with information, put pressure on us to do what we need to do to save this country. And I do not say that in a trite way. I do not say that to overstate the reality. I think that this national debt and this deficit spending is the greatest long-term threat to our country. So thank you for doing this, Representative Kilmer, and shining a light on this for the American people, and so that we can arouse the collective consciousness of Americans to once again put pressure on us to do the right things. Why not the State of the Union instead of State of the Nation? I mean, the State of the Union is a big deal, and it's been branded as a big deal. Why not fiscal state of the union is my only question, to keep it at that same level of import.
Any other members? The question is on agreeing to the amendment offered by the gentleman from Washington, Representative Kilmer. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Whitehouse votes aye. Mr. Yarmouth. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bennett votes aye. Mr. Roybo Allard. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schatz votes aye. Mr. Kilmer. Mr. Kilmer votes aye. Mr. Rono. Mr. Rono votes aye. Mr. Blunt. Yes. Mr. Blunt votes yes. Mr. Sessions.
Aye.
Mr. Sessions votes aye. Mr. Perdue. Mr. Perdue votes yes. Mr. Woodall. Mr. Woodall votes aye. Mr. Langford. Mr. Langford votes yes. Mr. Arrington. Mr. Arrington votes yes. Ms. Ernst. Ms. Ernst votes yes. Co-Chair Lowy. Co-Chair Lowy votes aye. Co-Chair Womack.
Aye.
Co-Chair Womack votes aye.
Any members haven't voted or wish to change a vote? The clerk will tally.
Of the members appointed by the Speaker of the House and the Senate Majority Leader on this vote, the ayes are 8 and the noes are 0. Of the members appointed by the House Minority Leader and the Senate Minority Leader, the ayes are 6 and the noes are 0. The amendment threshold is met.
And the amendment is adopted. It is now in order to consider amendment number 31 offered by Senator Schatz. The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 31 offered by Mr. Schatz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the great work of your staff and your engagement on this issue. We took this up in a previous hearing, and we weren't able to reach consensus. I think we may be able to actually adopt this. The compromise language, which we worked out with Chairman Womack, encourages the Budget Committee to offer transparent discussion on tax expenditure-driven policy changes that are included in the budget resolution. Currently, information on tax expenditures included in the resolution is limited to prior years. This would sort of smooth that out so that as we're dealing with our budgets, we're dealing with the tax expenditure question.
Anyone wishing to claim time in opposition to the gentleman's amendment? Any other comments on the amendment? If not, the question is on agreeing to the amendment offered by the gentleman from Hawaii, Senator Schatz. The clerk will call the roll.
Senator Blunt. Yes. Senator Blunt votes yes. Mr. Sessions.
Aye.
Mr. Sessions votes aye. Mr. Perdue. Mr. Perdue votes yes. Mr. Woodall. Mr. Woodall votes aye. Mr. Langford. Mr. Langford votes yes. Mr. Arrington. Mr. Arrington votes yes. Ms. Ernst. Ms. Ernst votes yes. Mr. Whitehouse. Aye. Mr. Whitehouse votes aye. Mr. Yarmouth. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bennett votes aye. Mr. Roybo Allard. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schatz votes aye. Mr. Kilmer. Mr. Kilmer votes aye. Mr. Rono. Mr. Rono votes aye. Co-Chair Lowy. Co-Chair Lowy votes aye. Co-Chair Womack.
Aye.
Co-Chair Womack votes aye.
Any members wish to change a vote or haven't voted? Clerk will tally.
Of the members appointed by the Speaker of the House and the Senate Majority Leader on this vote, the ayes are 8 and the noes are 0. Of the members appointed by the House Minority Leader and the Senate Minority Leader, the ayes are 6 and the noes are 0. The amendment threshold is met.
And the amendment is agreed to. It is now in order to consider amendment number 26 offered by the senator from Georgia, Senator Perdue. The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 26 offered by Mr. Perdue.
Senator Perdue is recognized in support of his amendment.
Thank you, Co-Chair. When we first met, we all agreed in here that one of the objectives was to end continuing resolutions as a way of doing business. This is nothing but a release valve for not doing our jobs. Until we've got real consequences for our inaction, we will always have to use the release valve of this continuing resolution. All we're doing here in this amendment is to create milestones for passing a budget exactly like we did this year. We started earlier. We broke the budget into 4 tranches, and appropriators did their jobs. I think if we give appropriators adequate time, they will indeed get these things approved. There's an issue here that I want to get into, but I'll save that for the end, and that is the difference between dealing with the debt and actually funding the government. All this bill does is it gives us a better chance of avoiding CRs in the future. Breaking into milestones, and we're suggesting 4 tranches of our discretionary budget this year, about 1.3 trillion, 25%, 50%, 75%, and 100%, timed to hit at the date of a typical break. And so it does 3 things. One, this bill would change the fiscal year to December 31, year ending 31. Why does that matter? The first year of a new Congress, we're already 3 months behind before we even start the process. It's no more complicated than that. Second, it breaks our appropriation bills into 4 tranches with due dates, and with consequences for around those due dates. So that does three things, and that's really all this bill is attempting to do. And I hope everybody seriously considers it. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Any other comments from members around the dais? Anyone who wishes to claim time in opposition? A distinguished co-chair is recognized.
I rise in opposition to the amendment. A number of proposals have been submitted that would require quorum calls, prohibit a chamber from recessing or adjourning for certain periods of time, or limit travel should we not pass a budget resolution or appropriations bills on time. Instead of giving a lengthy statement on each one, in the interest of time, I'd like to address all of my concerns at once. I agree we need to complete our work on time, but this amendment and the others similar to it that have been submitted would not help us achieve that goal. The appropriations process has been broken at times because of a lack of political will to make timely, difficult decisions. For instance, in September of 2016, Congress passed an FY 2017 CR through December 9th, punting any decisions until after the presidential election. And after the election, the Trump transition team told Republican leadership that their preference would be to have another CR and punt once more so that the incoming president could put his stamp on spending bills. Congress eventually needed a third CR before we passed an omnibus bill that was signed into law on May 5th, more than 7 months into the fiscal year. So I don't like denying agencies budget certainty until the year was more than half over, but Republicans thought it was the best way forward. Quorum calls, prohibitions on adjournment, or travel wouldn't have changed that mindset, and in many cases, whoever is in charge willfully kicks the can down the road. These penalties, in my judgment, won't fix another problem that delays enactment of spending bills, which is a broken authorizing process that leads to members attempting to add dozens of extraneous provisions to appropriation bills. Now, I've been ranking member of the House Appropriations Committee for 6 years, and every year, the full committee is asked to try to resolve problems that subcommittees cannot resolve on their own. And 9 times out of 10, the last items to be resolved aren't even related to funding, but instead are riders that belong in the authorizing bills. So far too often, our problem isn't a broken process that could be remedied by penalties, but the lack of political will to make necessary decisions and do what we all know to be inevitable. So I appreciate Senator Perdue's commitment to trying to find ways to ensure we complete our work on time, but in my judgment, this amendment is off mark. This amendment proposes to shift the fiscal year to coincide with the calendar year, and frankly, I don't think that does anything to solve our actual problems while creating some new ones. But I'll discuss this in more detail when we deal with an amendment specifically on that subject. So, my friends, I urge a no vote.
Senator Langford.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It is the 27th of November, and we have 7 more appropriation bills to go. And most of us have gone home and bragged that we are ahead of schedule. We've already passed 5 of the largest appropriation bills 20 years earlier than we've done before. So we're 20 years better than we have been, and it's the 27th of November. We have a rhythm in Congress. It's finishing up appropriation bills at the end of the calendar year. We've done it year after year after year. This amendment acknowledges the reality on the ground and says, let's go ahead and move the fiscal year to the calendar year, what we've done for decades. Let's acknowledge that's a better route. We do it already. We just have to do it with stopgap CR spending every single time to do that, which puts all of our contracting behind schedule year after year after year, and we lose the first quarter. This allows our contractors and all of the individuals that do all the work in the agencies to actually get a normal schedule, to be able to get it on the calendar schedule. So I think at some point we have to acknowledge we already run on a calendar year. Let's give the agencies the opportunity to not have to lose the first quarter every single year waiting on a CR for us to run on a normal schedule.
Other comments?
Mr. Chair.
Senator Perdue.
Well, I really appreciate the co-chair's comments, and I fully respect her leadership in this effort that we have with the JSC. She's actually making my case for me. I couldn't agree more that political will is a problem. The problem with that is that over the last 44 years, we've only funded the government 4 times, and I don't see that changing, frankly, given the realities of what we have today with an ever-increasing partisanship in this budget process. And in the Senate, that's because it's not a law, it's a resolution. So the majority has its will when it comes to doing the budget. And for the rest of the year, we end up having to dig out of that. That's why I've supported from the beginning Senator Langford's idea that this needed to be a law and we needed to get all the arguments out of the way early in the year. We have a model that actually works in the United States. And I'm not talking about public corporations or private enterprises. I'm talking about states. And states do 2 things. One is they have a schedule that works, and most of the time they get their state government funded within a 45-day window that they operate in. And the second thing is nobody goes home until they get the budget approved. Those are things that I think we should emulate, because other than doing something like this, I see no path that we're going to change any of the record that we have built up, the sorry record of fraud and other things that we have done with the American people. The approval rating in Congress is below 20%, no matter how you look at it, and it's probably only that high because our mothers voted for us. But I think that this is, yeah, well, mine didn't either. The number one reason for that, in my opinion, is our physical intransigence here. So I agree with the co-chair about political will. It's just that I think it's time for us to look at what does work around the country and try to emulate. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Representative Woodall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We get in a rut up here sometimes, and we start talking amongst ourselves. I was listening to what my junior senator said and what the gentleman from Oklahoma said. Every article I read talks about the 4 times we've gotten this right in the last 40 years. But the definition of getting it right is to fund $1 trillion+ discretionary spending bill on September 30th that agencies will then begin spending on October 1st. Our definition of getting it right is to give an agency about 12 hours to prepare for what the next fiscal year is going to look like. And what I so value about the senator's amendment is that he's not saying, let's push this off until Christmas, let's put this off until New Year's. He's saying, for the first time in almost half a century, let's give agencies a chance to know ahead of time, as much as 90 days ahead of time, what their allocation is going to be for the next fiscal year. We've just gotten into the rut of saying that failure is not funding the government, but success is funding the government at the 11th hour. That is not success, and that is not what folks expect for us. This is the only proposal that raises our expectations for ourselves as it comes to getting this done. I hope we will have the courage to say, yes, I'm not sure it's going to work. To the ranking members or to the co-chair's point, it's going to require a lot more than legislative language to get this done. But this gives us a shot in ways that we haven't had a shot before, and it's one I hope we will say yes to. I yield back.
Any other comments from around the table? Hearing none, the question is on agreeing to the amendment offered by Senator Perdue. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Whitehouse votes nay. Mr. Yarmouth. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bennett votes no. Mr. Roybo-Allard. Mr. Roybo-Allard votes no. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schatz votes no. Mr. Kilmer. Mr. Kilmer votes no. Mr. Rono. Mr. Rono votes no. Mr. Blunt.
Votes yes.
Mr. Blunt votes yes. Mr. Sessions. Aye. Mr. Sessions votes aye. Mr. Perdue. Mr. Perdue votes yes. Mr. Woodall. Mr. Woodall votes aye. Mr. Langford. Mr. Langford votes yes. Mr. Arrington. Mr. Arrington votes yes. Mr. Ernst. Mr. Ernst votes yes. Co-Chair Lowy. Co-Chair Lowy votes no. Co-Chair Womack.
Aye.
Co-Chair Womack votes aye.
Any member wish to change a vote? Clerk will tally.
Of the members appointed by the Speaker of the House and the Senate Majority Leader on this vote, the ayes are 8 and the noes are 0. Of the members appointed by the House Minority Leader and the Senate Minority Leader, the ayes are 0 and the noes are 7. The amendment threshold is not met.
And therefore, the amendment is not agreed to. It's now in order to consider amendment number 25, offered by Senator Perdue of Georgia. The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 25, offered by Mr. Perdue.
Senator Perdue is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. And for the sake of time, I will not make the same argument again. This is exactly the same amendment, but without the fiscal year. It just changes, puts some milestones in with the consequences around those breaks. That's we've already commented on the rest of it. Thank you.
Any other comments? Anyone to claim time in opposition? The question is on agreeing to the amendment offered by the senator from Georgia, Mr. Perdue. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Blunt. Yes. Mr. Blunt votes yes. Mr. Sessions.
Aye.
Mr. Sessions votes aye. Mr. Perdue. Mr. Perdue votes aye. Mr. Woodall. Mr. Woodall votes aye. Mr. Langford. Mr. Langford votes yes. Mr. Arrington. Mr. Arrington votes yes. Ms. Ernst. Ms. Ernst votes yes. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Whitehouse votes nay. Mr. Yarmouth. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bennett votes no. Mr. Roybal Allard. Mr. Roybal Allard votes no. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schatz votes no. Mr. Kilmer. Mr. Kilmer votes yes. Mr. Rona. Mr. Rona votes no. Co-Chair Lowy. Co-Chair Lowy votes no. Co-Chair Womack.
Aye.
Co-Chair Womack votes aye.
Any member wish to change a vote? Clerk will tally.
Of the members appointed by the Speaker of the House and the Senate Majority Leader on this vote, the ayes are 8 and the noes are 0. Of the members appointed by the House Minority Leader and the Senate Minority Leader, the ayes are 1 and the noes are 6. The amendment threshold is not met.
Therefore, the amendment is not agreed to. It's now in order to consider amendment number 21, offered by Senators Ernst and Langford. The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 21, offered by Ms. Ernst.
Gentlelady from Iowa is recognized in support of her amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. And again, as we've discussed previously, Senator Perdue just acknowledged that the most essential role that we have as a federal government and as a Congress is to raise that revenue and fund our federal government. But since 1974, we have only passed all of our appropriations bills 4 times, and in the past 20 years, we've only passed a budget 11 times. So I do think we can do better. Many of us do believe that, and the only way that we will do better in the absence of political will is by forcing ourselves to do this. And my amendment would establish consequences for senators if we do fail to pass a budget and our appropriations bills on time. So the way it works, if we haven't passed a budget by May 1st of an odd-numbered year and all appropriations bills by the beginning of each fiscal year, then the Senate would be unable to adjourn for more than 8 hours. No funds would be available for official travel for senators, and we would do 2 quorum calls per day to ensure that senators are staying in Washington to get their work done. Now, Congressman Arrington will be offering a similar amendment that will apply to the House of Representatives, and paired together, these common sense amendments would provide a very powerful incentive for Congress to complete a budget and get our appropriations bills done. So state work periods are very important to all of us, believe me. I do a 99 county tour every year. It's called the Full Grassley. We do owe it to our constituents to complete our work on time. So we do understand those state work periods are important, but funding the government takes precedence. So I do think we should stay here until we get that work done. Thank you. I yield back my time, Mr. Chair.
Gentleman from Washington, Mr. Kilmer.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. So I think one of the things that has frustrated me and certainly frustrates my constituents is that when Congress fails to do its job currently, when there's a continuing resolution or worse, a government shutdown, the consequences of that failure of Congress to do its job falls on them. You know, I represent a large naval base where when the government shut down for 17 days, people got furloughed and weren't sure whether they were going to be able to put food on the table. I represent more military veterans than nearly anybody in the House. And the uncertainty that that provoked when there's a government shutdown causes a lot of pain on the ground. When the national park in my district was shut down for 17 days, that not only impacted those federal employees, it impacted the local businesses that depended on park visitors to come and visit. And so as we go through these amendments that set up enforcement mechanisms, I intend to vote for them, and I intend to vote for them because I think it changes the game so that the consequences don't fall on our constituents when Congress doesn't do its job. It falls on Congress when Congress doesn't do its job. And it pains me that a mechanism like this is necessary, but I think if passed as prologue, it may indeed be necessary. And right now, the consequences of inaction by Congress fall on our constituents, and I don't think that's right. I don't think it's right to put that pain on the folks we represent. So I'll support this amendment and the others too.
Mr. Chair.
Senator Langford.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. The very first meeting we had together when, as I described it then, we were all in our early optimistic phase. When we gathered at that point, we all discussed what is it we want to get out of this. And I think everyone around the table mentioned the end of CRs and the end of government shutdowns. I think we all did. And the conversation has spun around those two items with bipartisan conversations, bicameral conversations. How do you do that? How do you end CRs? How do you end government shutdowns? This is the way that bubbled out, that you create a mechanism where you stay to be able to finish the work. Now, I came into the House in 2011, and in January 2011, the first thing we had to do was to be able to pass the spending that was punted from 2010, that they didn't want to finish it then, so they punted it to 2011. So I started by working on appropriation bills from the previous years because that had been carried. That's been done year after year and will continue to be done until we have something in place to, as the Representative Kilmer said, to actually we have to do our job, and that is stay in place. I can't tell you the number of times there's been a CR that's passed and I get home and I'm out doing town hall meetings or in the grocery store and someone catches me and says, "What are you doing here? I thought y'all were in Washington, D.C. Is the funding done?" And I have to look at them and go, "No, it's not done. It got punted for 2 or 3 months." But they're still amazed we're back in state when they know our job is still really here. This is pretty simple. This is we have a job to do. We stay and negotiate until the job is done. It provides a leverage. All of us have seen Congress only acts when it has to. This puts the has to, and we stay and work it out.
Senator Perdue.
Thank you, Co-Chair. We already have a model, I mentioned this earlier, that actually works. This year, we had an opportunity to fund 100% of our federal government discretionary spending on time. We got very close. On July 31, however, we only had 12% of appropriation bills done in the United States Senate. Now, the House was ahead of us at that time, but only 12%. Had we gone home in August, that's where we would have been, because when we came back in September, we only had something like 10 or 11 work days in the Senate to fund the other 88% of the federal discretionary budget. As it turned out, we stayed in the Senate in August and not only passed 43 confirmations, but we took appropriations from 12% complete to 75% complete. And I don't consider that success, but it's a step in the right direction, and it does show that even though you haven't changed the political will, by putting consequences on, you actually can get our work done.
Representative Lowy.
Well, with great respect for all of our members on both sides of the aisle, I'm not going to read my statement again. But I still want to say very briefly that this amendment doesn't address the major reasons for not passing appropriations resolution. I've talked before about the authorizers not doing their work, riders. We have 100 riders or more. So there are a lot of reasons why we don't complete our work, and maybe we should have some more discussions about them. I'm not sure that there are many who would oppose attaching hundreds of riders to these appropriations bills. But, so I'm going to oppose this amendment. You don't want to hear a long statement again. Thank you.
Any other comments? Representative Arrington.
Mr. Chairman, I agree with our co-chair in her previous comments about the lack of political will. And I think we would all agree that the nature of this body politic does not seem to be able to muster the collective will to do some things. It's like human nature. If you don't acknowledge it and then deal with it, you'll get the same ridiculous, dysfunctional outcomes. So in agreeing that we have a political will problem, we have to look at the incentives and rightly align them so that we get the behavior that not just that we need to function, that the American people are counting on us to put in place so that we do the basic job of just funding the government. And so this to me is pretty fundamental. I don't know, I'm a new member again, and so it's fresh on my mind. I know if you go back and think about when you ran for the first time and you railed against the dysfunction of this institution. And you said it's broken and they just don't know how we in real America operate every day. And then you come up here and it's just like, here I have this unbelievable blessing to sit at this table with you guys, smarter, wiser, more experienced. But I just want to challenge everybody to ask yourself the question that if you go back to your district and you poll your folks, wherever you come from, urban, suburban, or rural like where I hail from, and ask that question, do you think if Congress can't get their job done, basic responsibility of funding the government, do you think they ought to be able to go home and take a break? I would dare say 95% would respond, hell no, they should not come home and take a break. They should stay and do their job like the rest of us. So pardon my frankness and my crassness, but that is, to me, a basic test we ought to apply to some of these fundamental questions.
That's how they say it in West Texas, right?
Yeah, so I channeled my inner West Texas farmer there for a minute. I apologize to the team.
Representative Lowy.
You were so eloquent, I just want to respond very briefly, because I don't question the integrity and the commitment of any member. So perhaps, as you watch the appropriations process, if a member is passionate among a poison pill, and he gets a couple of other people, what I call a poison pill, and we can't resolve it not because someone's mean or nasty, but they are passionate about that issue. This is very difficult to resolve in a timely way, and I would say some of those people are so passionate, they'll say, come hell or high water, I'm not changing my mind, until the body politic somehow does get them to change their minds. So it is very difficult to perhaps distinguish between a passionate objection, one that is due to a person's integrity and commitment to that issue, but because, again, as I said before, the authorizers in many situations just don't do their work. These controversies are left to the Appropriations Committee, and it's very difficult. So I'm not sure depriving somebody of a vacation, or I won't get into that, but these are challenges that we do have, and we'll talk in a more lengthy way sometime. Thank you.
Representative Woodall.
Mr. Chairman, I tell folks that I used to be a strong and powerful man, and then I ran for Congress, and now my scheduler tells me where to go and what to do all day long, every day. I don't question anybody's work ethic here. You all are probably just like me. You work twice as hard at home as you do here, because the schedule is so aggressive. But what I have learned in this committee, thinking back to those early days of optimism that the senator from Oklahoma referenced, is that when we made time to get together with one another, when we made time to sit down with one another, we made progress. When we were sitting around a table, we were able to find understanding and move the needle forward. And when we got too busy to sit down together, that progress slowed down. I don't view this amendment at all as a punishment. I view this amendment as a prioritization. And if you leave empty days on the calendar, I will fill them up with work back home. But if we haven't finished our work here and we keep those days on the calendar, we will fill that up with partnership, looking for those solutions, not just appropriations solutions, but those authorizing solutions that the gentlelady from New York accurately said need to come about. This is about making time on the calendar to be successful. I'm tired of those grocery store conversations about how unsuccessful we are. This is a small step towards giving us a chance to be more successful. I hope we'll vote yes.
Ms. Roybal Allard.
just like to make a couple of points, because I'm opposed to the amendment. First of all, using what happened in the Senate in August, to me is an example of why this amendment is not necessary, because leadership in both houses always has the power and the ability to cancel our recess. So number one. And number two, I think it's also important to note that when we do go home, the work does not stop. Our staffs are working every single day to work out the disagreements so that at any point in time when we finally do agree and have a bill, we can then come back and support it. So for those two reasons, I think it's unnecessary, using August as an example of why it's not necessary, and also the point that the work continues even when we're not here. Because most of the work anyway is done and negotiated by our staffs. And they are in constant contact with us either when we're here or whether we're back home to keep us updated on what the negotiations are. So work doesn't stop. And for those two reasons, I'm opposed to the amendment.
Other comments?
Mr. Chair, on the
Senator
first,
Perdue.
on the first reason, I would respond that in 44 years, this is the first time that it's ever been done voluntarily. We need this bill, our amendment.
Any other comments? Question is on agreeing to the amendment. Amendment number 21 offered by Senator Ernst. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Whitehouse votes nay. Mr. Yarmouth. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bennett votes no. Mr. Roybo-Allard. Mr. Roybo-Allard votes no. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schatz votes no. Mr. Kilmer. Mr. Kilmer votes yes. Mr. Rono. Mr. Rono votes no. Mr. Blunt.
Blunt votes yes.
Mr. Blunt votes yes. Mr. Sessions. Mr. Sessions votes aye. Mr. Perdue. Mr. Perdue votes aye. Mr. Woodall. Mr. Woodall votes aye. Mr. Langford. Mr. Langford votes yes. Mr. Arrington. Mr. Arrington votes yes. Ms. Ernst. Ms. Ernst votes yes. Co-Chair Lowy. Co-Chair Lowy votes no. Co-Chair Womack.
Aye.
Co-Chair Womack votes aye.
Any member wish to change a vote? Clerk will tally.
Of the members appointed by the Speaker of the House and the Senate Majority Leader on this vote, the ayes are 8 and the noes are 0. Of the members appointed by the House Minority Leader and the Senate Minority Leader, the ayes are 1 and the noes are 6. The amendment threshold is not met.
And as a result, the amendment is not agreed to. The question is now in order to consider amendment number 22 offered by Senator Ernst of Iowa. The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 22 offered by Ms. Ernst.
Senator Ernst is recognized in support of her amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair, and I am, of course, disappointed that the first amendment did fail. My next two amendments, I'll briefly talk about the first one. It's a stripped-down version of the one that we just voted on. So the Second Amendment only penalizes the Senate for failing to pass appropriations on time. So again, not focusing necessarily on the budget, but failing to pass those appropriations on time. And if we have not passed all regular appropriations bills individually or collectively by October 1st, then the Senate would be unable to adjourn for more than 8 hours. No funds would be available for official travel for senators, and again, the 2 quorum calls would be held per day to ensure that senators stay in Washington, D.C. And I am just going to make a brief comment to the gentlelady that understanding our staffs do work very hard on this, but we are the ones that provide direction and leadership, and I think it would be sorely disappointing for our constituents to think that it is the staff that is constructing legislation and not the members. So we are here for a purpose. We need to work together, we need to collaborate, and we need to have strong dialogue in order to get things done. It shouldn't be left entirely up to our staff. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
Comments from members? Anyone to claim time in opposition? Hearing none, the question is on agreeing to the amendment number 22 offered by Senator Ernst of Iowa. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Blunt.
Blunt votes yes.
Mr. Blunt votes yes. Mr. Sessions. Mr. Sessions votes aye. Mr. Perdue. Mr. Perdue votes aye. Mr. Woodall. Mr. Woodall votes aye. Mr. Langford. Mr. Langford votes aye. Mr. Arrington. Mr. Arrington votes yes. Ms. Ernst. Ms. Ernst votes yes. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Whitehouse votes no. Mr. Yarmouth. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bennett votes no. Ms. Roybo-Allard. Mr. Roybo-Allard votes no. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schatz votes no. Mr. Kilmer. Mr. Kilmer votes aye. Mr. Rono. Mr. Rono votes no. Co-Chair Lowy. Co-Chair Lowy votes no. Co-Chair Womack.
Aye.
Co-Chair Womack votes aye.
Any member wish to change a vote? Clerk will tally.
Of the members appointed by the Speaker of the House and the Senate Majority Leader on this vote, the ayes are 8 and the noes are 0. Of the members appointed by the House Minority Leader and the Senate Minority Leader, the ayes are 1 and the noes are 6. The amendment threshold is not met.
And as a result, the amendment is not agreed to. It's now in order to consider amendment number 23, offered by the senator from Iowa, Senator Ernst. Clerk will designate.
Amendment number 23, offered by Ms. Ernst.
Gentlelady is recognized in support of her amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. And again, okay, this time we're not focusing on appropriations. This time we are focusing on the budget resolution. So if we have not passed a budget resolution by the 1st of May, then all previous penalties would apply to our senators. So with that, I would urge a yes vote. I'll yield back.
Any members wish to comment? Hearing none, the question is on agreeing to the amendment. Amendment number 23, offered by Senator Ernst of Iowa. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Whitehouse votes no. Mr. Yarmouth. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bennett votes no. Ms. Roybo-Allard. Mr. Roybo-Allard votes no. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schatz votes no. Mr. Kilmer. Mr. Kilmer votes aye. Mr. Rono. Mr. Rono votes no. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Blunt votes yes. Mr. Sessions. Mr. Sessions votes aye. Mr. Perdue. Mr. Perdue votes aye. Mr. Woodall. Mr. Woodall votes aye. Mr. Langford. Mr. Langford votes aye. Mr. Arrington. Mr. Arrington votes aye. Ms. Ernst.
Yes.
Ms. Ernst votes yes. Co-Chair Lowy. Co-Chair Lowy votes no. Co-Chair Womack.
Aye.
Co-Chair Womack votes aye.
Any member wish to change a vote? Clerk will tally.
Of the members appointed by the Speaker of the House and the Senate Majority Leader in this vote, the ayes are 8 and the noes are 0. Of the members appointed by the House Minority Leader and the Senate Minority Leader, the ayes are 1 and the noes are 6. The amendment threshold is not met.
And as a result, the amendment is not agreed to. It's now in order to consider amendment number 24, offered by Senator Ernst of Iowa. The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 24, offered by Ms. Ernst.
Gentlelady is recognized in support of her amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. And this last amendment would prevent funds from being used for official travel for senators if we have not passed a budget resolution by May 1st and appropriations bills by October 1st. So basically, no federal dollars used for travel. It would be upon the members and their own pocketbooks. So with that, I'll yield back.
Comments or questions from other members? Hearing none, the question,
I have a quick
correction,
question.
I'm sorry, Senator Schatz.
Is this to and from your duty station, your either your home state or your district, or is this official travel other than going home?
It would be all official travel,
All
so
official
federal
travel.
funds used for all official travel.
Other comments or questions? The question is on agreeing to the amendment offered by the gentlelady from Iowa. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Blunt. Mr. Blunt votes yes. Mr. Sessions. Mr. Sessions votes aye. Mr. Perdue. Mr. Perdue votes aye. Mr. Woodall. Mr. Woodall votes aye. Mr. Langford. Mr. Langford votes aye. Mr. Arrington. Mr. Arrington votes yes. Ms. Ernst.
Yes.
Ms. Ernst votes yes. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Whitehouse votes no. Mr. Yarmouth. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bennett votes no. Ms. Roybo-Allard. Mr. Roybo-Allard votes no. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schatz votes no. Mr. Kilmer. Mr. Kilmer votes aye. Mr. Rono. Mr. Rono votes no. Co-Chair Lowy. Co-Chair Lowy votes no. Co-Chair Womack.
Aye.
Co-Chair Womack votes aye.
Any member wish to change a vote? Clerk will tally.
Of the members appointed by the Speaker of the House and the Senate Majority Leader on this vote, the ayes are 8 and the noes are 0. Of the members appointed by the House Minority Leader and the Senate Minority Leader, the ayes are 1 and the noes are 6. The amendment threshold is not met.
And as a result, the amendment is not agreed to. It is now in order to consider amendment number 27, offered by Representatives Arrington and Kilmer and Senator Ernst. The clerk will designate.
Amendment number 27, offered by Mr. Arrington.
Representative Arrington is recognized in support of his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is a companion piece on the House side to Senator Ernst's amendments. And let me just quote a couple of statistics that I think are very alarming. That since 1995, that's 23 years it's been since Congress has operated under regular order, meaning Congress has passed a conference report on the budget resolution followed by all appropriations bills. Congress has, as we said, relied too much on these CRs. It would be 176 times that we have defaulted to a continuing resolution between 1977 and 2017. Over that same period, Congress has shut down the government 19 times. I recall from the early days of our discussions, when hope sprang eternal, from Senator Perdue, that, and these were his words and I'm paraphrasing, I hope that we can achieve at least one positive outcome out of this committee, and that is to ensure that there's more predictability and certainty in this budgeting process and appropriations process, and that we do that basic function. And while I would have loved to reach for the stars and the moon and deal with the national debt, it was pretty clear early on that that was going to be difficult to impossible. But what I believed was possible in a bipartisan way was to align the incentives and to put the enforcement mechanisms in place to have that certainty so that we prevented the wasteful, dysfunctional, inefficient CRs and shutdowns. 176 times since 1977, and we can't come up with a better idea, because I'd love to hear a better idea than just putting an incentive like, if you don't finish the work, you can't go back home. You've got to finish it in order to do that, and that seems pretty common sense to me, Senator Ernst. So I'm introducing this with my friend from Washington State, two very different places, West Texas and Washington State. We did an op-ed together. I had to make sure we didn't just say Washington, because that sounds like DC, so we said Washington State. I know that you can convince your colleagues to do the right thing on this and to put these measures in place so we can hold hands together and work our way down the field and really make the American people proud that we will stay as long as it takes and do whatever it takes to get the job done. That's the way I was raised in West Texas, and I bet you that's how you were raised in Washington. Mr. Kilmer, I yield. Or
Other
Mr.
comments?
Chairman, I yield, and then I hope Mr. Kilmer will.
Representative Kilmer, you're recognized.
Thank you. Thank you, co-chairs, and thank you to my friend from across the aisle and across the country for your collaboration on this. My rationale for supporting this is the same as what I said previously. Unfortunately, congressional inaction does have consequences, and unfortunately, currently those consequences are primarily, if not entirely, felt by our constituents. And I think an amendment like this changes that, and that's why I support it.
Are there any other comments around the table? Any other members wishing to speak? Hearing none, the question is on agreeing to the amendment offered by Representatives Arrington, Kilmer, and Senator Ernst. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Whitehouse votes nay. Mr. Yarmouth. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bennett votes aye. Mr. Roybo Allard. Mr. Roybo Allard votes no. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schatz votes no. Mr. Kilmer. Mr. Kilmer votes aye. Mr. Rono. Mr. Rono votes no. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Blunt votes yes. Mr. Sessions. Mr. Sessions votes aye. Mr. Perdue. Mr. Perdue votes aye. Mr. Woodall. Mr. Woodall votes aye. Mr. Langford. Mr. Langford votes yes. Mr. Arrington. Mr. Arrington votes yes. Mr. Ernst. Mr. Ernst votes yes. Co-Chair Lowy. Co-Chair Lowy votes no. Co-Chair Womack.
Aye.
Co-Chair Womack votes aye.
Any member wish to change a vote? The clerk will tally.
Of the members appointed by the Speaker of the House and the Senate Majority Leader on this vote, the ayes are 8 and the noes are 0. The members appointed by the House Minority Leader and the Senate Minority Leader, the ayes are 2, the noes are 5. The amendment threshold is not met.
And as a result, the amendment is not agreed to. It is now in order to consider amendment number 30, offered by Senator Perdue of Georgia. The clerk will designate.
Amendment number 30, offered by Mr. Perdue.
Senator Perdue is recognized in support of his amendment.
To our earlier conversation about this is just the fiscal year, just change the fiscal year. I'll make one more comment, and we beat it to death. But right now, in the real world, people get the end of their budget process done after strategic planning, and then they allow basically a quarter to put the implementation plan in place. And as Congressman Woodall reminded us earlier, we give ourselves about 12 hours. In many cases, we don't do that because we're operating under a CR anyway. My argument about this is very simple. This is a no-brainer. If the rest of the world were looking at this and they're saying in your first year of a new Congress, you start 3 months behind and you've only done this 4 times successfully in 44 years, wouldn't you give yourself at least in that first year just 3 more months to be on time? And the second argument is that it's a much more cost-effective way of running the federal government. I don't care what your expense level is, if you can plan for the execution of what you've already agreed to spend. Thank you.
Members wishing to comment? Senator Langford.
If I can make a brief comment. I talked to someone in the Pentagon of the upper brass that said that this year they had to go and train contracting officers how to do contracting in the first quarter, because most of our contracting officers had never in their work history ever not functioned under a CR in the first quarter. And they literally didn't know how to do it. That's a sad commentary of where we are. This fixes that and gets us to the point that there's some predictability in the process and we're not having to do workarounds constantly in the agencies.
Other comments? Hearing none, the question is on agreeing to the amendment offered by Senator Perdue. This is amendment number 30. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Blunt.
Blunt votes yes.
Mr. Blunt votes yes. Mr. Sessions. Mr. Sessions votes aye. Mr. Perdue. Mr. Perdue votes aye. Mr. Woodall. Mr. Woodall votes aye. Mr. Langford. Mr. Langford votes aye. Mr. Arrington. Mr. Arrington votes yes. Mr. Ernst. Mr. Ernst votes yes. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Whitehouse votes no. Mr. Yarmouth. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bennett votes aye. Mr. Roybo-Allard. Mr. Roybo-Allard votes no. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schatz votes no. Mr. Kilmer. Mr. Kilmer votes no. Mr. Rono. Mr. Rono votes aye. Co-Chair Lowy. Co-Chair Lowy votes no. Co-Chair Womack.
Aye.
Co-Chair Womack votes aye.
Any member wish to change a vote? Hearing none, the clerk will tally.
Of the members appointed by the Speaker of the House and the Senate Majority Leader on this vote, the ayes are 8 and the noes are 0. Of the members appointed by the House Minority Leader and the Senate Minority Leader, the ayes are 2, the noes are 5. The amendment threshold is not met.
And as a result, the amendment is not agreed to. It is now in order to consider amendment number 28, offered by Senator Bennett of Colorado. The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment 28, offered by Mr. Bennett.
Senator Bennett is recognized in support of his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to withdraw this amendment, but before I do, I'd like to thank Senator Langford as well as Representatives Arrington, Kilmer, and Woodall. The 5 of us and our staffs worked for months to see if we could find common ground. We didn't succeed in the end, but we worked in good faith and managed to find important areas of agreement. I have submitted the legislative text of an amendment that reflects the broad contours of what that group discussed, knowing that we didn't come to an agreement. I want to make that clear for the record, and I won't ask for a vote on this amendment, but Mr. Chairman, I want to acknowledge the work that we did together, and in the hope that this can serve as some bipartisan basis for further work. So that's it for that amendment.
Without objection, amendment number 28 is withdrawn. It is now in order to consider amendment number 19. This is the Yarmouth amendment, and my understanding is Representative Roybal-Allard is going to introduce this amendment. The clerk will designate.
Amendment number 19, offered by Mr. Yarmouth.
And Ms. Roybal-Allard is recognized for 5 minutes in support of the amendment.
Mr. Chairman, I'll be reading a statement for Mr. Yarmouth. Over the course of the last few months, we've talked a lot about our concerns with the failings of the budget and appropriations process. We've noted that the budget resolution has become an ideological statement and not a serious plan. We've highlighted that the budget resolution and appropriations are not completed on time, and that too often the process degenerates into a game of shutdown brinkmanship. But we haven't spent nearly enough time talking about one of the biggest roadblocks to a rational budget and appropriations process in recent years, and that is the caps enacted in the Budget Control Act of 2011. Those appropriations caps were themselves the result of a game of brinkmanship over the debt ceiling. The Budget Control Act, which I opposed, was essentially ransom paid to avoid the unthinkable, a government default that likely would have destabilized our and the global economy for years to come. And so Congress created caps on discretionary spending along with a committee to agree to policies to reduce the deficit. But in this poisoned political environment where compromise is considered defeat, the committee was destined to fail, and the law's fallback procedure took effect, requiring extremely deep reductions to the already very tight limits on discretionary spending. We've been working around this obstacle to responsible budgeting ever since. We've come together to increase the caps in the past, but there has been a toll. Although we all knew from the start of the 115th Congress that the existing caps for 2018 and 2019 were unworkable, serious negotiations did not begin for months, and Congress did not reach agreement until well after the 2018 fiscal year began. This is not the way to govern. The amendment I offer today puts an end to this irresponsible game that fools no one. It repeals the remaining discretionary caps
those for fiscal years 2020 and 2021, and returns us to regular order. Congress would reclaim its Article 1 responsibility of the power of the purse. We would decide the appropriate level of discretionary spending and how it fits within the broader budget framework. This is what the Congressional Budget Resolution is designed to do. Establish limits on the level of discretionary spending, along with levels for mandatory spending and revenues, which are enforceable through points of order laid out in the Congressional Budget Act. In keeping with the way this committee has been run, this amendment does not support any given policy outcome. There is, however, broad consensus that the total level of discretionary spending allowed under the statutory caps is far too low. After all, they were designed to be extreme to force Congress to act. Without changes, total discretionary spending will decline by approximately $125 billion in 2020. That represents an 11% cut in defense and a 9% cut in non-defense from the base levels that were provided this year. Both types of spending are essential in maintaining a strong economy and protecting our people. And I think it's always important to remind my colleagues on the other side of the aisle that non-defense spending includes health care for our veterans, cutting-edge research at NIH, programs that help make college more affordable, and resources for law enforcement, including the FBI and many other top priorities. We need to build on the agreement reached earlier this year and provide adequate levels of spending for discretionary programs, and we can do that. Without the overly austere statutory caps in place, the congressional budget process has the tools to move us forward and responsibly address the fiscal challenges we face as a Congress. Therefore, I ask for your support for my amendment.
Are there comments from other members? Representative Woodall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I enjoy serving on the Budget Committee with Mr. Yarmouth. I don't support this amendment, but I know how passionate he is about it. I think about the bill that Senator Bennett just withdrew, and folks are going to look at what it is that we accomplished on this committee. I'm going to be very proud of this committee's work product. But in the same way that Senator Langford has been growing the vote on chimps year after year after year, now to a bipartisan vote there, we can get to where Mr. Yarmouth wants to go here. And very early in our conversations, we talked about tying the change in the caps to a statutory debt to GDP ratio, and I thought we had very productive conversations in how we could get that across the finish line. We didn't make it all the way there, but I hope that folks will not look at some of these amendments that have gone down, as I believe Senator Whitehouse mentioned earlier, as a reflection of lack of support for the underlying policy, but just a recognition that we haven't grown the vote to where we need to grow that vote today. But we've made strides that I might have imagined were not possible when we began this process, and I hope this will serve only as a beginning and not the end. I will oppose the amendment.
Representative Lowy.
Thank you. I strongly support the Yarmouth Amendment. And ever since 2013, the Budget Control Act caps have been the biggest obstacle to getting appropriations finished on time. Those caps were set at levels widely regarded as unacceptably low, whether one is concerned about the defense cap, the non-defense cap, or both. Congress has been fixing this problem 2 years at a time, which delays appropriations until a new agreement to raise the caps is enacted. The most recent caps deal wasn't even enacted until 4 months into the fiscal year. We finished the appropriations bill 6 weeks later, but by then the fiscal year was nearly half over. Under current law, the 2020 caps will be cut by $71 billion for defense and $55 billion for non-defense, levels that are unworkable for Democrats and many Republicans. So again, we'll have to wait for a new cap adjustment agreement. A big reason we're putting the budget resolution on a biannual schedule is to speed up appropriations by providing a 2-year allocation up front. But that will do no good as long as appropriations top lines are controlled by the BCA caps. So let's pass the Yarmouth Amendment, go back to using the Congressional Budget Resolution to set appropriation limits.
Senator Blunt.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I'm going to vote for this. I certainly understand people who will vote against it. I was a supporter of the Budget Control Act, but we have now moved so far beyond the Budget Control Act that if we begin next year assuming that the law is not changed and that we have to budget and appropriate based on 11% cut in defense spending and a 9% cut in non-defense spending, we all know that's not going to happen. And it makes it impossible. Congresswoman Lowy just went through the schedule of what happened a year ago when we finally make some agreement for the previous year, well into almost halfway through the fiscal year. It looks like to me we're setting ourselves up to do that again. And what happens when you do that is you wind up with so many decisions being made by 4 or 6 leaders in a leadership room that don't have the information they need. And then the rest of us spend the rest of the next year explaining why that decision was made, even though no logic was behind it if you really understand the intricacies of some of these policies. So I fully understand the reason to try to control spending. I was a supporter of the Budget Control Act, but we have moved beyond that, and I'm going to support the Yarmouth amendment.
Representative Arrington.
Mr. Chairman, I can't envision a scenario whereby we would allow ourselves a pass to not finish our budget and appropriations work and go home, and on the way out, take the spending caps off. I can't go back and explain that one. And I do respect the senator, and I know where he's coming from, and I don't think it's the best tool. It is a, no pun intended, a blunt instrument, and it's not very strategic, and we need something better. But until we come up with that, and I was open to the debt ceiling, removing that, and even the caps. If we could get that debt to GDP target and the glide slope, as Mr. Senator Whitehouse often discussed in our group, then I would be open to that. But until we do something else that will afford a better and more responsible outcome, that seems to be the one tool remaining for some modicum of spending restraint. And for that, I think we ought to just let the next Congress decide if it needs to be adjusted. I yield back.
Mr. Chairman.
Senator from Hawaii.
I very much support this amendment because we know that we're going to have to probably deal with the impact of the BCA, particularly the Department of Defense, and we've been doing that, as Co-Chair Lowy has mentioned. So why don't we remove this as yet another area in which political brinksmanship can be exercised, because don't we have plenty of other areas that we're going to have debates over? So sequestration was never supposed to happen, and yet it happened. And you know, caps are okay if they're realistic. We all know that these caps were unrealistic to begin with, and they were never supposed to happen, but they happened. So I am very much for removing the caps for the 2020, 2021 years.
Other comments?
Mr. Chairman, one last comment, and that is, it wasn't realistic to cut, and I think in many ways to a point of diminishing returns on the discretionary side, although I think there's plenty of room to cut on the discretionary side. But I agree that the focus and the brunt of those cuts fell on a third of the budget. What we need to do is have proportional cuts. We need to look at what's driving the debt. If we were a business, we would look at those things that are driving the debt, and we deal with them. But those are the most difficult. That's why I'm glad we were able to keep reconciliation, at least on an annual basis. But I still would oppose this because it's not perfect, but it's the only, at least somewhat good tool in the tool belt to restrain spending.
Other members who wish to be heard? Senator Perdue.
Mr. Chairman, in an ideal world, I am absolutely against the debt ceiling in the BCA for one reason: they never worked. However, I strongly believe that they're outside the scope of this select committee. I believe that when it first came up. I still believe it now, even after hearing the argument. To use political brinksmanship When we can't get the political will to end the vote-a-rama in the United States Senate, give me a frickin' break, guys. That's a joke. Thank you.
Other members? Senator Schatz.
I just want to explain, I'm going to vote for this because I think we should lift the caps, but I agree with Senator Perdue. I think if it's a good thing this is the last one, because this is pretty well outside of the scope, and this could spiral pretty quick if we were taking up amendments like this.
Any other comments? Hearing none, the question is on agreement to amendment number 19, offered by Mr. Yarmouth through Ms. Roybal Allard. The clerk will call a roll.
Mr. Whitehouse.
Aye.
Mr. Whitehouse votes aye. Mr. Yarmouth. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bennett votes aye. Ms. Roybal Allard. Ms. Roybal Allard votes aye. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schatz votes aye. Mr. Kilmer. Mr. Kilmer votes aye. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hirono votes aye. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Blunt votes yes. Mr. Sessions. Mr. Sessions votes no. Mr. Perdue. Mr. Perdue votes no. Mr. Woodall. Mr. Woodall votes no. Mr. Langford. Mr. Langford votes no. Mr. Arrington. Mr. Arrington votes no. Ms. Ernst. Mr. Ernst votes no. Co-Chair Lowy.
Aye.
Co-Chair Lowy votes aye. Co-Chair Womack.
No.
Co-Chair Womack votes no.
Any member wish to change a vote? The clerk will tally.
Of the members appointed by the Speaker of the House and the Senate Majority Leader on this vote, the ayes are 1 and the noes are 7. Of the members appointed by the House Minority Leader and the Senate Minority Leader, the ayes are 7 and the noes are 0. The amendment threshold is not met.
And as a result, the amendment is not agreed to. It's now in order to consider amendment number 29, offered by the gentleman from Colorado, Senator Bennett.
Thank
the
you,
clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 29, offered by Mr. Bennett.
Senator Bennett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and this is the last one, or my last one, and I want to thank you and your co-chair for doing such a good job with this committee over the last number of months. In the decade that I've been here, through no fault of the chair or the ranking member, the decade that I've been in Washington, we've passed 39 continuing resolutions. That is 1,288 days on temporary budgets, nearly 40% of my time here. Over that period, we've also shut the government down twice and produced America's first ever credit downgrade. And as I mentioned the first day when we met, if any school board in Colorado or city council in my state came to voters with a 39th continuing resolution, they would be run out of office. But that's how we've been running the most important government in the world. And it's led me to think about what would actually end the insanity in our budgeting process and put us in a better position to deal with our fiscal challenges. The result is this amendment, which I'm calling the Fiscal Reform Act. We find ourselves today, as others have said, at a moment when our back is really against the wall. Our debt is skyrocketing toward 100% of our GDP by the end of the next decade. We're spending roughly 22% of our GDP, and we're collecting in revenue something around the neighborhood of 16%. This is a dangerous and unsustainable course, which I think everybody in this committee agrees with. And all of this is to say that we've got a lot of work to do, and I'm grateful for the committee's constructive approach. We're contending also with a monumentally dysfunctional system of government, and we've got to fix it. Our plan would represent a realistic overhaul of the current process. It would help us finish appropriations on time and make it easier to do the hard work to address our deficits. First, we'd get rid of the budget committees and reassign staff to a joint committee on fiscal responsibility. That committee would look like this one, 4 members from each party in each house. If the committees produced a bill to cut the debt by 5% of GDP or more by the end of the decade, and that bill earns bipartisan support, it would receive an up or down vote in both houses without amendment. Second, this plan eliminates the budget resolution, but maintains reconciliation, since we know a majority would never part with that tool. At the same time, we restore reconciliation to its intended purpose by reinstating the Conrad rule to ensure that it's never used again to increase deficits. Third, we let appropriators get back to appropriating. If the full Senate or House doesn't like the 302 A's and B's the appropriators produce, they can impose caps for a year, 2 years, or 10 years through regular order. Otherwise, bipartisan work among appropriators can begin at the start of a new Congress. Fourth, we'd make the fiscal calendar align with the actual calendar year, not just because it's simpler, but because it acknowledges the real timelines that drive our behavior up here. Fifth, this plan would eliminate the federal debt limit. If the only thing this committee did was end the threat of default, this entire process would have been worthwhile. And while I won't ask Mr. Chairman for a vote on this amendment, I'd like to have it in the record in the hope that the work that you have led will allow us to reach the kind of bipartisan decision-making we really need to move this government forward in a place, in a manner that is acceptable to the American people. With that, I yield the floor.
Does the gentleman withdraw the amendment?
I withdraw the amendment.
And without objection, the amendment number 29 is withdrawn. Are there any other amendments? Anyone wishing to comment? Senator Langford?
Mr. Chairman, briefly on this, just to comment, I don't have an amendment because we didn't have time to be able to finish, but Senator Whitehouse and I have had some very constructive conversation trying to look and see if there are areas where we can find agreement. He and I and our staff have worked to be able to put together a package similar to what Senator Bennett just presented there, putting some of the best of elements together, making reconciliation a normal part of our process, but including things like what Representative Kilmer put in there to get a true Conrad rule in, that it has to do deficit reduction in the 10-year window with the 80-20 rule that we've talked about before, knowing that there's never going to be 100% pure reconciliation, but to be able to allow us to be able to have that to where it's focused in on actual debt reduction and putting in place every single session of Congress. In fact, in this proposal, every year, if we do a budget resolution and we do appropriations, we also do reconciliation, and Congress can choose in a future time if they want to do $10 or if they want to do $10 billion. They have the opportunity to do that, but there is a focus on it. With that, the trade-off would be is that we would eliminate the bear trap in the bedroom. We would eliminate the debt ceiling. The debt ceiling's purpose is Congress is focused in on trying to focus on debt. If there's a way that we have that every single year, some vote focused on debt, that accomplishes that purpose to be able to do that. We were not able to get this finished, to be able to get it out to everyone in time, but I hope that we can actually get this passed in a future time as a standalone and to be able to see if we can't solve some of the problems and have something valuable come out of this process long-term for us, and significant, quite frankly.
I thank the gentleman. Senator Whitehouse.
Thank you, Chairman. Let me thank both you and Chairman Lowy for the way you've conducted these proceedings. I think it's been a terrific experience for all of us to have not only bipartisan but bicameral conversations, and I want to express my appreciation to my Republican colleagues in the Senate, Senator Blunt, Senator Perdue, Senator Langford, and Senator Ernst, for the terrific way that we've worked together and actually gotten some pretty cool things done on a bipartisan basis, along with my distinguished colleagues on the Democratic side. I think we share a certain amount of frustration that we didn't get more done, but as Senator Langford just said, I think the groundwork for future progress has been laid in this committee. So I'm not only pleased with our work to date, but I'm also pleased with the prospects that it's created for future work. I would be a strong substantive yes on this measure, but I must note, and I've brought this up several times before, and I've brought it up with colleagues on the floor, that at this point, there is a very strong concern on the part of the minority leader in the Senate that this measure, if it comes to the Senate floor, will become an avenue for parliamentary tricks and mischief. I understand that the majority leader has told people that he has no intention of doing that and that he intends to bring this up as a clean bill, and he has certainly the power to do that by filling the tree and bringing it forward. But the person who needs to hear that in order to settle this question is Senator Schumer, the minority leader. And to date, that conversation has not taken place. And for the life of me, I can't imagine why, if the majority leader is willing to tell colleagues that he has no intention to do this, he can't confirm that and nail that down with the minority leader and put this issue behind us. It's been an issue that's been kicking around and that I've raised before. So I feel very frustrated that we are stuck where we are, but until that's resolved, I must be a no vote, even though I would be a very strong yes vote substantively, and I really hope that we can get this resolved quickly, because I don't truly believe that it's anybody's intention to turn this into a vehicle for parliamentary tricks, but why not just nail that down with a floor agreement?
I yield to the distinguished co-chair, Ms. Lowy.
Thank you. And I'd like to just say a few words before we proceed. This really has been a bipartisan process. I thank all the members. I really did hope it would stay that way. Following up on my good friend Senator Whitehouse, it was 2 weeks ago I privately discussed with co-chair Womack and then publicly raised at our markup the need for a floor agreement between Senators McConnell and Schumer to ensure that partisan amendments would not be added to the bill we report out of committee. I hope that recessing for a week would provide enough time for a deal to be reached. Unfortunately, I've been told by Senator Schumer that the majority leader is not willing to enter into any agreement, and in the absence of such an agreement, our work really is at serious risk of partisan sabotage in the Senate. So unfortunately, and I want to say again, this has been a really good bipartisan experience, but many of us are not prepared to vote to report the bill out of committee. Thank you.
I'll claim time to respond here in just a minute, but I'd like first to yield to Senator Blunt of Missouri.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and both to you and Co-Chairman Lowy. I think this has been a great effort. I think it's been bipartisan. I think we've tried to work together in a bipartisan, bicameral way, and if we're successful, I believe this could become a pattern that could add many of the things that we didn't get added that I think there was a broad base of support for. If we're not successful, I really have a hard time imagining why we'd want to visit this particular opportunity again. I'm not involved in discussions between the minority leader and the majority leader, so I'm not in a position to characterize those. I do know that the Senate rules haven't changed since we started our work. And I do know that it takes 60 votes under the matrix we're working under for anything to be done to change the work we submit. So it would seem to me that the minority is fully protected in a 60-vote world when there are 51 Republicans and 49 Democrats. Clearly, as we come to the end of the year, something we should have understood when the deadline was November the 30th for our work to conclude, that we'd come up against an end-of-the-year set of circumstances that might make it difficult to commit early to exactly how much time you'd give to this debate. But I have a hard time seeing how the minority is disadvantaged in a 60-vote world in the Senate. I don't have any advice for either the chairman or the co-chairman about the way to move forward at this moment. I do think it would be really regrettable if we take the things we have been able to agree on and are not able to move forward with those. I would see this, as I believe Senator Whitehouse mentioned in his remarks, as a pattern that you could build on, but we won't be able to build on it if at the last minute we decide that we're going to leave this up to two people who aren't on the committee with rules that have never changed since we began this work. I would hate to see that happen. I would trust the good judgment of the co-chairman to try to figure out a way where we could successfully report. I believe we have to do that by the end of this week, and again, I have no particular advice here, but I would hate to see this pattern, while not perfect, certainly the effort has been substantial. I'd hate to see the pattern wind up with no result that the House and Senate get to vote on, debate, and look forward to a way that we could, in future years, maybe have a greater discussion on the topics that we didn't get the kind of bipartisan, bicameral agreement here that we needed. I would just say there's a 60-vote requirement. The rules of the Senate are the same today as they were the day we started, and I don't want to question anybody's desire to know whatever they think they need to know, but I have a hard time seeing the partisan disadvantage here. The thing I do see clearly is we don't have much time to get this done, and making commitments about exactly how this is going to happen, except the way the Budget Committee has to report out and the Senate and House both have to vote if we have a successful product. I'm concerned that we not lose the moment here if we can figure out a way to avoid not losing the moment.
Senator Langford.
Thank you. To follow up on Senator Blunt's comment, I think we are in a pattern. We all went through the history documents of budget reform back in May and had a hearing on the history of this process. Many of the proposals that we brought out and discussed and just voted down were proposals brought up in the 1970s by a fiscal commission, in the 1980s, in the 1990s. So we are in a pattern, and we're apparently continuing that pattern. I had a protracted conversation with Senator McConnell 2 weeks ago when I first learned of this issue of Senator McConnell having some quiet secret plan to be able to pull a fast one in the Senate. Not only was he shocked by that, his first comment was, I hadn't even considered that. And the second thing is, I couldn't even do that if I wanted to because it takes 60 votes to get a motion to proceed. I then went and visited with Senate staff for Senator McConnell. His staff went and visited with Senator Schumer's staff and said, absolutely there is no plan to try to do some secret something separately, and nor could there be, because if you can show me 9 Democrats that are going to join us on the secret plan, I wish you would have shown me those 2 years ago, because it would have been more fun than the last 2 years. So there's not even a way to even do that. So I'm not sure where this rumor started or how to be able to get it to stop or to have leaders visit. The leader's staff visited. I have no idea if the leaders have visited on this, but for some reason this has come up at the tail end, and I don't see where this goes or how it's even possible in the end when it's a motion to the floor to where it's assured to get a floor vote, but you still have to get 60 to actually move it anywhere.
Representative Yarmouth.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've been here 12 years and I've never cast a vote yet based on what I thought the Senate might or might not do. While there are ways in which this proposal might have been even more appealing to me, there's nothing in it that would cause me to oppose it. So with all due respect to my colleagues here on the Democratic side, I intend to vote yes.
It's good to have you here. Senator Perdue.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman and Co-Chairman Loy. You know, on March 7th, we started out here with a process, and I've been encouraged by that process, even though, in my opinion, we're not ending with a result that I nor many of us had hoped for, and that was a politically neutral platform from which we can fund the government, regardless of which party's in the majority, on time. What we're ending up with is a product that will not achieve that goal, in my opinion. So to represent to our Senate colleagues or to your House colleagues that this will do that and it achieves the objective that most of us had here, I can't do that. And I think the lesson here is, isn't it just like us to sit here and spend 20 minutes talking about a rumor or about the shenanigans that go on in the Senate as opposed to what really is at issue here? And the issue is that the United States is in a moment of financial crisis, and we're diddling. We're dealing on bicameral issues, our cameral issue, we're dealing on partisan issues. And frankly, by just changing the biennial, going to biennial budgeting will not achieve what we were hoping for. Senator Hirono said it very succinctly in the very first meeting. I'm not really interested in doing anything that won't help us eliminate the need for CRs. And that's what we end up as a byproduct, or as a product here out of this committee. I applaud everybody's effort. It's been a long journey in the last 9 months, but we're ending with a product that I can't represent to my constituents as a step forward in trying to get to a politically neutral platform that responsibly funds the government on time, regardless of which party's in power. Thank you.
Senator Whitehouse.
May I make a proposal? As much as this effort has captured our attention, there's a lot going on the Senate floor, and the leaders have had a lot to consider, and I'm not sure that they have had a moment of sort of do or die focus on this at this point. And until the voting was done today, it wasn't clear to anybody what this measure was going to look like. So now we finally have a measure that our work is completed here. We know what we are going to be voting on, And I very much want to get to yes, and I very much want to vote yes. And I would request that we find a way to give 24 hours or 36 hours or some period of time to the Senate to have the conversations that may be needed to either assure ourselves that the 60 votes that Senator Blunt talked about are an adequate protection for the minority, or that the majority can make the requisite assurances that there will not be parliamentary mischief done. Obviously, none of us have been in those conversations, but I think if we could buy just a little bit of time so that we, now that we have something to take to our leaders, could be able to do that and in our own way let them know that we would like to proceed and resolve this. I think there's a prospect still of getting to yes. And I would hate to foreclose that possibility with a vote right now while we haven't had that final last call at the old saloon here.
The great discussion, and understand the concerns. It would be very unfortunate, given the work that this committee has done, to get to this stage of the game with the finish line right in front of us and not be able to run right through the tape, because I recognize, just in listening to the comments, that there is a lot of support for what we've done, and why shouldn't there be? We have really done great work against the threshold, a voting threshold of 5 and 5 that I think speaks well of what this committee has been able to produce, given that we all wanted other things differently, but the threshold is the threshold. The latest that I understand we could actually finish our work and meet our statutory deadline would be sometime on Thursday, if I'm not mistaken. So if the request is to postpone the final vote on passage of the product that we have as amended, then I would recommend that we be back here tomorrow sometime, 24 hours, to sort this out and be able to, because I sense from the meeting that, from the comments, that people want to pass this, that there's no real strong opposition other than the prospect of what may or may not happen given the leadership in the Senate. So I'll yield to the distinguished co-chair.
I concur. I won't repeat all the comments. They've been so eloquent. But I respectfully ask that we make the deadline 9 o'clock Thursday, because we have leadership elections on Wednesday. So if everyone concurs, let's come back Thursday at 9. Does that work?
Thursday at 9 can be made to work by me.
Let's make it work.
Mr. Chairman, as I understand, also what we're trying to do is get what the final proposal would look like to the Senate leaders, so they can look at it, hopefully agree, and get that done tomorrow, and then we would be back on Thursday at 9 to vote on that amended package.
Is there a motion to postpone till 9 a.m. Thursday?
I'd make that motion.
Motion by Blunt, there's second by Whitehouse. Is there other discussion? We'll do this by voice. Those in favor of the postponement of the final vote until 09 on Thursday morning, say aye. Aye. Anyone opposed? Motion carries. The committee stands adjourned until 9 o'clock Thursday morning.